Welcome to the Exeter Historical Society's March virtual program. I'm Laura Martin, and I'm having a tough time here. Co-executive director of the Historical Society. We are coming to you tonight from the banks of the Squamscott River. I'd like to thank Exeter TV for bringing this program to you through Zoom. The program is also being presented on our Facebook page and on Channel 98. A programming note. And on this, we have some unfortunate news. We have had to postpone our scheduled April program, Town by Town, Watershed by Watershed, Native Americans in New Hampshire, to early spring 2022. We had hoped that we would be able to host a small audience at the Historical Society by April of this year, which the speakers require, but that is not yet possible. We are postponing it until a time when we should be able to gather in person. Let's hope so. With that said, we plan to present one of Barbara's programs. You'll be able to find information about and register for the program on our website and Facebook page within the next week. Sorry, he's still upset. Tonight, the speaker will be taking questions at certain times during the program. Barbara will be monitoring the Q&A dialog box at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to type your questions there or raise your hand if you'd like to speak your question. If you are listening on Facebook, you can write your questions in the comments and we'll try to get to those as well. If you are interested in learning more about Exeter's history, visit our website at exeterhistory.org. And if you're a member of the Society, we thank you. And now a brief introduction to tonight's speaker. Marina Kirsch is an author and presenter who encourages audiences to adopt a lifelong dream, goal, and vision powered by love and supported by faith. Her presentations, based on her award-winning book, Flight of Remembrance, have been provided at over 100 venues in 11 states over the past 9 years. Lots of numbers there. They explore a different perspective on the war through her family's experiences on the other side, and also promote the continued preservation of World War II and Holocaust memories. A resident of Kensington, New Hampshire, Marina is a freelance graphic designer, book designer, and editor, as well as an officer and distinguished Toastmaster with the Exeter Speak Ups Club and a New Hampshire Humanities speaker. She considers connecting with audiences a great privilege and a delight. Please help me welcome Marina Kirsch.
Thank you very much, Laura. Good evening, friends. Is there value in stories from both sides of a world conflict, or only in those from the victors? And what if the vanquished regime directly or indirectly caused the death of 50 to 70 million people worldwide, including millions of Holocaust victims? Would it change your answer? That's 50 to 70 million people gone. If you conducted 5 funerals a day, it would take over 27,000 years to bury 50 million, and over 38,000 years for 70 million. World War II was a cataclysm without precedent, and Germany was the chief aggressor. I will share my screen now. This evening, you will hear my family's story as recorded in my book, Flight of Remembrance. It's a story from the Axis side of the war, and it includes 2 German veterans. The 2 main protagonists, my parents, Rolf Dutzmann, a Latvian aeronautical engineering student, and Lila Wasul, the young woman he met in 1940 Berlin, who became my mother. Back in 2004, before I ever even thought I would write a book, someone said, but it's a story about Nazis. And this came despite the fact that no one on either side of my family supported Hitler or joined the Nazi Party. For many years, though, as a result of that question or that comment, I wondered whether the timing would ever be right for a story about German people during World War II. However, I came to realize the therapeutic potential of a true story that gives a face, a name, and humanity to the enemy, rather than denying or burying the past. Thank you very much to the Exeter Historical Society and New Hampshire Humanities for hosting this event, and to all of you for attending. I know there are at least a couple of people from other states. I feel really privileged to be a presenter for New Hampshire Humanities. It's an organization that provides a wide array of fantastic quality programming across the Granite State. So what can you possibly gain from Flight of Remembrance, a story from the other side of the war? I can think of three things. First, you will hear how love and dreams aided by faith in God can prevent despair and promote survival in adversity. Our dreams today are truly the hope for tomorrow. You will also find out what it was like to live through war waged on home soil on the losing side. And this is something that has only been experienced in the US during the Civil War. A number of years ago, I spoke in Manassas, Virginia, and I think there might be at least one person here tonight who attended my presentation there. And I asked them, how many of you remember what it was like after the Civil War? Well, no one raised their hand, but a number of people did have ancestors who lived in that part of the country after the Civil War. Realistically, in Europe, all of Europe, and not just Germany, was the loser in World War II. And all of those countries suffered tremendously long after the war ended. Now, the third thing that you might get out of tonight is that you will help preserve memories of World War II and the Holocaust. If your ancestors were in Europe during the war, you might even recover some parts of their World War II past. I'd like to actually find the stories in our audience tonight. So I will ask some questions at this point. And since I can't see all of you anyway, I think I won't unshare my screen. Laura and Barbara, what do you think? I could just leave the screen sharing on and we could get people's answers?
Yep, that sounds good.
Okay, so here are the questions. I always still have to ask this, and I'll probably ask it till the end of my life if I'm giving these presentations at age 90. Are there any World War II veterans present, Allied or Axis? If we don't hear anything and like a count to 5, I'll assume there aren't any. But the last presentation I gave live last February before COVID hit, there was a World War II veteran, a female Navy veteran. Are there any spouses of World War II veterans here tonight? Okay, I'd also like to know how many of you, and I'm not sure how we will gauge this, but maybe you could raise a hand or put something in the Q&A. How many of you had relatives who served in World War II, ancestors? Is there anyone who has a particular story about World War II from the aspect of an ancestor who served? And by the way, we will have discussion and Q&A afterwards as well. Oh, I did. Someone said I did.
Marina, 8 or 9 people raised their hands to having a relative.
Okay, all right, great. And all right, so one person here in Q&A also said I did. We will have more time for discussion later, and I hope that some of you might be willing to share what some of your ancestors went through. The last question I'm going to ask at this point, were you or any of your ancestors living in a part of the world during the war where it was actually fought? So between 1939 and 1945, were you or your ancestors living in Europe, Ukraine, Soviet Union, North Africa, Philippines, Japan, China, or somewhere else? And I think at least one person here tonight will say yes to that on the part of his ancestors, but we'll see later during Q&A. Are there any hands up for that one?
There were two.
Okay. I'm wondering if Guntis Gonkarovs is here.
Yes.
Fabulous. Guntis, I hope you are ready to speak later. I will appreciate it very much. His family was from Latvia, like my dad and his family. So now I'd like to go on and talk about my family story in a nutshell. Let's go through this again. As shown on the cover of my book. With the helmet, my father, Rolf Dutzmann, after fleeing from Latvia to Germany before the first Soviet takeover, he was drafted into the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. This was a disaster for him, personally speaking. The swastika on his helmet, though controversial, is the only cover element that identifies my book as a story from the Axis side of the war. So I felt it was important to keep it. In the background behind him is the ruined family home in Berlin. So after they fled to Germany, their home there in Berlin was destroyed. And here, my parents, Rolf and Lilo, on their wedding day, November 1944, in Germany. And my older brother, Ingo, age 2, born in post-war Bavaria. Up top, above the title, a small illustration that I created from a photo of my father, Rolf, flying a pre-World War II Latvian glider. That little icon symbolizes two things. First of all, my father's overarching goal in life to further the field of aeronautical engineering, but also my own quest for a higher and a wider perspective on World War II through researching, writing, and sharing my family's story. Audience stories also continue to widen my perspective, so I thank all of you in advance. And here, the finalist symbol from the 2012 USA Best Book Awards in the Narrative Nonfiction category. How many of you, I'm wondering, are familiar with this book, Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl? It's on a suggested reading list that I will share with Laura Martin at the Exeter Historical Society after my presentation, since I wasn't able to share it in chat. And she will then share it with anyone who is on the list. You've probably all supplied your email address, so you will receive the file. Viktor Frankl was a Jewish concentration camp survivor. After the war, he founded the third Viennese school of psychotherapy, which is called logotherapy. It focuses on finding meaning in life. Frankl amazingly found meaning even at Auschwitz. Even though they never knew Frankl, love, dreams, and their Christian faith, in the case of my family, helped them all find meaning and visualize a life beyond the cataclysm. So I'd like now to go back to 1924 Latvia. My father, Rolf, second from left, is with his mother, Maria, his little sister, Ruth, and his father, Ernst. Ernst is in Latvian military uniform, and he too had a dream. From boyhood, he would sit on the hillside of his parents' farm and gaze out toward a sliver of the Baltic Sea on the horizon. His dream was always to be captain of a ship bound for America, but unfortunately, that would not be possible during World War II. Like millions, of young people in the 1920s and 30s, Rolf wanted to be part of the exciting new field of aeronautical engineering. Remember, aeronautics was still very young at that time. Here he is at age 14, he's the one at left, and he's been building model gliders for years from plans in American and German magazines. By this time, he could already speak and read English, a skill that would save his life near the end of the war. And by age 18, he was winning national awards for models like this one, and was also building a full-size glider and a full-size motorized plane. Here he is flying the glider, which he built with the Izargs in 1938. This photo inspired the small cover illustration that I showed you earlier, the one that came flying in. The Izargs were the closest thing Latvia had to a National Guard between the world wars, but they were permanently disbanded after the first Soviet takeover. Now, my grandmother, Maria, wore the same museum quality dress in 1935 in the left photograph that I usually wear for my presentations today. She hand-tailored and embroidered it in the early 1930s and then altered it to fit me when I was a teenager. It still fit me before COVID. We'll see if the miracle continues once I reemerge from isolation. The embroidery on it was confirmed by a costume museum in Riga as an authentic Latvian pattern. And the jewelry I'm wearing is an early 1900s Korzem brooch from the southwestern Baltic region where the family lived. We still have a remarkable collection of my grandmother's needlework that survived the war, along with letters, documents, photographs, and other memorabilia from both sides of the family. But it was the family history written by my parents, Rolf and Lilo, in the early 1990s and shared with their children and grandchildren that impressed upon me what a treasure my family's story is. And that inspired me to share it. I think all of you could probably consider what should be preserved and shared from your family's past that might be a treasure for future generations. Now a question. Can anyone guess which country was most feared across Europe, especially by German people during World War II? If you have the ability to unmute, or Laura, Barbara, if you could unmute people and let them just shout out the answer, I would appreciate it. Does anyone know? All right, no one is talking, but I'm not sure that you don't necessarily have the answer. I think some of you know. It's Russia or the Soviet Union. In October 1939, just after the outbreak of war, my father, Rolf, age 20, was studying aeronautical engineering at the University of Riga. He had just begun the education he had dreamt about all his life, when an ominous phone call came from his father, Ernst, urging him to come home immediately. That call marked the end of life as Rolf knew it. A Soviet takeover was imminent. And like other families of German descent, who, by the way, were scattered all across Europe, not just in Germany, they faced a high risk of execution or deportation under a Soviet takeover. However, unfortunately, the only country offering refuge was Nazi Germany. My grandfather Ernst was especially at risk as not only an outspoken anti-communist, but also because of the fact he had served as a Tsarist Russian officer during World War I, and then a Latvian officer between the world wars. To the Dutzmann family, in 1939, the verdict on Hitler and the Nazi regime was still out, but the Stalin regime had long been recognized as a brutal, oppressive regime with little respect for human life. And many Latvians, as Guntis will probably tell you later, had already recognized the Soviet regime as their enemy. And this, for many people in Latvia and the other Baltic states as well, automatically made Nazi Germany the only refuge available to them. Now, they could have given in to all this, but their love for each other and dreams for the future led Rolf and family to escape Latvia while they could. Rolf, Maria, and Ruth, Rolf's sister Ruth, shown here in the fall of 1939, shortly before they, Ernst, and 50,000 other Latvians of Baltic German heritage fled to Germany by ship. Their sense of foreboding was chillingly accurate. Shortly after the Soviet takeover, Latvian officers who failed to flee were shot on the spot, and tens of thousands of citizens were executed or deported. It was not a happy time. Latvia, like other Eastern European countries, especially the other Baltic states and Poland, suffered wave upon wave of tragedy. First, the Soviet takeover of 1940, then, as shown here, the Nazi occupation in 1942, during which 75,000 Latvian Jews were murdered. This photo is taken from German wartime military archives. Then finally, another disastrous Soviet takeover in 1945. And imagine, each time, mass executions and deportations. In Eastern Europe, there was no right and wrong side to the war, and there was no option to remain neutral. In most cases, the side that people chose determined whether they would live or die. And in many cases, such as for Baltic Germans and Jews, the side that they chose was largely dependent on their ancestry. Let's go now to a map of December 1939 Northern Europe, which had already changed exponentially. In the light tan, Germany proper, including East Prussia to the right. In the darker tan, the areas already annexed by Germany, including the former Austria, and here, half of Poland. The other half of Poland in red, occupied by the Soviet Union. Also part of the family story, Switzerland and Slovakia. To the north, the Baltic states of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. Rolf and family lived north of the city of Liepāja in Kara Osta, a military enclave on the Baltic Sea, where Ernst, Rolf's father, my grandfather, headed a department in a munitions laboratory. When the family fled in December 1939, it was via this dotted line from the capital city of Riga to the island of Usedom, which was part of Germany proper. And as soon as their ship left port, they and 2,000 other Latvians on board became people without a home, people without a national identity, and people at risk of being drafted upon arrival. Not only that, but they were also completely at the mercy of the Nazi regime. One of the family's worst fears was soon realized when the regime ordered them to occupy Poland, the most dangerous place in all of Europe at the time. First to the city of Posen. Actually, I think I screwed up there. Here, we're going now from the island of Usedom to Posen in occupied Poland. So we're heading east toward Soviet territory. Here is Rolf on the train en route to occupied Poland in March of 1940. He is apprehensive whether the regime will allow him to continue his education or whether they might draft him right away. And Maria at the left side of this photo pondering what the family's fate will be. Their immediate fate? In Posen, they were accommodated in crude, unheated barracks. They received dismal rations and slept on the floor on straw. Things didn't really look very good. From Posen, they were ordered further east to Litzmannstadt or Lodz, even closer to the Soviet threat. But then later in 1940, the regime sent the family to Berlin. And by October of 1942, fully aware of my grandfather Ernst's technical skills, they drafted him as a major into the Wehrmacht, the German army, and then sent him back to the island of Usedom, where they had started their German sojourn. There he worked at the top secret development center of Peenemünde, where he trained for V-2 rocket inspection under Werner von Braun, the German rocket genius. That site, though, was bombed in August 1943. Originally top secret, obviously no longer top secret. After that point, the regime chose a safer location for mass production of the V-1 and V-2 rockets, here in the heart of Germany, at a place called Nordhausen, where there was a top secret underground installation called Mittelwerk. And it was there that my grandfather worked for the last 14 months of the war at that underground installation. Finally, I'd like to show you the city of Danzig or Gdansk. Look at the little corridor of Poland up on the Baltic Sea and you'll see the city flying in. I'll be mentioning that shortly. The other half of the story, though, is my mother, Lila Wassel, born and raised in Berlin. Here she's age 2 with her parents, Gertrude and Walter. Just as in Rolf's family, no one in her family joined the Nazi Party or supported Hitler. And she had a strong faith in God from a young age. Lila refused to join the League of German Girls, equivalent to Hitler Youth for boys, considering it to be sinister, fanatical, and atheistic. She was fortunate that she was able to avoid involvement, but 1 year after she graduated, all school-age young people were forced to join the Nazi youth groups. It's easy to see how they would be indoctrinated. Lilo also had a dream. You see the theme here in the family? Key people had dreams, and those dreams helped to keep them all alive and to continue looking forward, looking to the future. Her dream was for a harmonious home and family life, which was lacking in her childhood due to her parents' rocky marriage and eventual divorce. Here, she's 19 years old, and she is about to meet Rolf at an afternoon dance in Berlin. Her dream would get underway with that meeting. In mid-1940, Rolf received word that he would be allowed to finish his aeronautical engineering studies in that city I showed you, Danzig or Gdansk. He hoped the war would be long over before he graduated so that the military would not be thrust upon him. Now, at one time it was a free city of Europe, but no longer. As you can see, it was no longer free. This photo is from Getty Images. In late 1941, though, Rolf's dream came crashing down. Simultaneously with his diploma, a draft notice came in the mail. He was drafted into the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. Here, he was home on leave, and he may have been reading about every German soldier's worst fear, the Eastern Front. Stories of unspeakable horror were floating back from the vast snowbound Russian countryside, and they were often in the news. Rolf was fortunate, however. He was employed in a technical capacity for most of the war, including teaching aerodynamics and airplane design and engaging in glider flight training and navigator training toward the end of the war. These were also all pursuits that supported his dream and kept him from being sent to the front until very late in the war. He never flew bombing or combat missions against the Allies. I'm very, very happy to report that. Nearly 1.4 million tons of bombs fell on Germany during the war. It's virtually inconceivable. Berlin alone was a target of 363 air raids by the Russians, by the British, by the Americans. Now, I will ask another question. I don't know if anyone can answer me. If you're able to unmute, or Barbara, Laura, if you can unmute people, please do so. I'd like to know, does anyone know which two German cities suffered even worse bombing in terms of intensity and the resulting firestorms?
Marina, in order for us to unmute them, if they could raise their hands.
Okay. Does anyone know which two cities suffered even worse bombing?
Guntis, you may speak.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, okay. I know that Dresden was one of those.
Absolutely.
My grandparents on my father's side went through Dresden with the firebomb that was going on there, and I'm trying to remember what the other one was.
The other is in the western part of Germany. Anybody?
I have two more people. Susan Clark.
No, I was going to say Dresden because I've been to Dresden and I know it was heavily bombed, but I don't know the other one. Sorry.
Okay, we'll ask the next person, which is Thomas. Thomas Benner.
My guess is Cologne.
That's a really good guess. Cologne got badly bombed, but actually the worst was Hamburg, Germany, and Dresden. So thank you everyone for your answers. So shown in this photograph that you see is the ruined family home in Berlin. This is the exterior, which I also used for the front cover of my book. And here is the interior. And the only reason we have these photos is because my father, Rolf, took bombing leave and traveled to Berlin to inspect the damage. He had heard that the home had been destroyed. And my mother Lilo's home was also destroyed, one floor at a time, until finally the top two floors were blown away, walls and ceiling badly damaged, windows shattered, pipes burst and water flowing into the apartment. She and her mother could no longer live there. The regime, however, would not allow working people to leave Berlin. They were forced to stay. However, love and dreams, they persisted. And especially thanks to my grandmother Gertrude, my mother's mother, they eventually received permission to move to a smaller town that never got bombed during the war. And that was in March of 1944. By that time, bombing was pretty bad already in Berlin. The rest of Lilo's family, however, remained trapped in the Soviet zone, which later became East Germany, and she never saw them again, including her father. Here is the only known photo of my grandfather Ernst as chief inspector of V2 rocket mass production at the underground installation of Mittelwerk. So this is where the V2 rocket and the V1 too were mass produced. I had to conduct a lot of research into his role during the war because he never talked about it. We only knew what his role was. We knew what his title was, and we knew that he was a major in the German army, but that was it. Not even my father, Rolf, knew more. Imagine my alarm then, when I found out at a point when I thought I was done writing my book, that there was a horrific slave labor camp set up outside the gates of this underground installation by the SS before my grandfather ever even arrived there. Ernst was in charge of the inspection department, which had more than 200 Army and civilian engineers and 3 inmates working in it. They all reported to him. I felt absolutely sick with dread over what else I might discover. However, books and post-war transcripts from inmates indicated that Ernst befriended and saved the life of Czech inmate Yuri Benish. and protected all three in his department as best he could under daunting circumstances. Dire circumstances, in fact. Benish survived the war and later wrote a book, including details about his relationship and conversations with my grandfather. And this photo was only discovered after my grandfather's death. I donated it in 2011 to the memorial that now stands at the site of that former camp. And there were also other documents that we had in our family possessions that I donated there. I have three great regrets. One, that my grandfather Ernst probably never knew that Yuri Benish survived the war. Two, that he will always be listed among the perpetrators just for having worked in that place. And three, that I did not know the questions to ask him while he was still alive. He would have provided some very frank answers to my questions. Here is a rubble-filled tunnel in the vast underground network at Mittelwerk as it looks today. Today it's called the Mittelbau-Dara Concentration Camp Memorial. And this is not a place, my friends, where the advanced rocket technology is touted and glorified, but rather it is a place of commemoration for the inmates who toiled and died there. In November of 1944, with Allied troops poised to strike into Germany proper, a daunting and terrifying time for all German people, both military and non-military. A love story was unfolding that would continue over 70 years and across 2 continents. But the most dangerous times for German civilians and military personnel alike were still ahead. Within 6 months, both Rolf and Ernst would be taken prisoner of war, and Lilo and Gertrude would be forced to flee the advancing Soviet troops more than once. Worst of all, for nearly a year after their wedding, neither Lilo nor Rolf knew whether the other was even still alive. In March of 1945, shortly after this photo was taken, Rolf and tens of thousands of other German military personnel were sent to the front. This was the Nazi regime's last desperate attempt to turn the tide of the war. But there were no weapons left to give out, and the war was as good as over. Everyone knew it. Rolf's unit was ordered to disperse, and they knew what that meant. It meant desert, escape the front, walk homeward. So Rolf and his companions did. Rolf walked 160 miles cross-country homeward in late winter, hoping to find a home and a family still there. And this, my friends, is the main difference in war waged on home soil. Not only military personnel, but also family members and homes are in harm's way. Between this photo and the next, I'm leaving out the most cathartic part of the story for you to read about in the book, how love and dreams, aided by Lilo's mother Gertrude, forged a dramatic reunion. I will let you know at the end how you could order a book if you would like to. Now here is my favorite post-war photo of Rolf and Lilo. They were smiling down at their post-war dream. My older brother Ingo at age 2. And by age 3, lo and behold, their post-war dream had grown a tail. It was sewn onto his overalls by our grandmother Maria, the same grandmother who made the embroidered dress that I showed you earlier. As children of German people, my brother and I have had questions about complicity and awareness most of our lives. We have a younger brother too, but he is a natural-born American citizen, and things don't seem to get to him, or he doesn't think about them quite as deeply perhaps as Ingo and I did. Originally, I thought everyone must have known about the death camps and the Holocaust. There were so many victims, perpetrators, Hitler's speeches. I also wasn't really sure that I wanted to know. I was afraid of the answers I might find. After years of reading, research, and discussion, however, including with my parents, very frank discussions, I realized the truth is not so simple. Most in the upper echelons of the military, the government, and some industries were aware of everything. And let's be clear, everyone knew about the existence of concentration camps, but they didn't necessarily know what happened in them or who was sent there. Remember, people were disappearing everywhere, all across Europe. My family disappeared from Latvia. No one knew where they went except for immediate family. People were disappearing. Also, many people did not know about the death camps, I am convinced. Neither Nazi-controlled media nor Allied sources published accounts of the killings during the war, and the regime was careful to hide the truth from many of its citizens, including the truth about the existence of those death camps in occupied Poland. Rolf and Lila were horrified to find out about the industrial-scale genocide from foreign publications after the war ended. Even my grandfather Ernst may not have been fully aware of the genocide because camps at the installations where he worked, and there was a smaller one too, called Trossenheide at Peenemünde, those camps held primarily captured partisans and resistance fighters, and very few Jews or members of persecuted groups. If I had to guess, however, I think my grandfather probably did know. He had this relationship with the inmate Yuri Benish, who had been to a number of camps, but Grandpa didn't talk about it, and I didn't know the questions to ask. The book that's on my World War II reading list that you hopefully will receive after this presentation from Laura Martin, entitled What We Knew by Johnson and Rubin, concludes that about 1/3 of the population knew much, 1/3 suspected something but had little proof, and 1/3 may have been totally clueless. It is a subject that is still plagued by denial today, and we will probably never know the complete truth. I welcome discussion on this topic. Feel free to ask me questions. I may or may not know the answers, however. For years, I've wanted to add something more substantive on the subject of genocide. A couple of years ago, I took a course on genocide studies. Here are the main points I came away with. Although there may be a dictator in control, by and large, it is ordinary people, not madmen, who perpetrate genocide, and they largely believe the propaganda. According to genocidewatch.org, 20 to 30 countries are currently at risk of genocide or already experiencing it. Warning signs leading up to genocide: political instability, often a dictatorship, exclusionary ideology with one or more identified scapegoats, and a national policy of isolationism with little or no international involvement. When I gave this presentation before COVID broke out live, and even back in May, I said only 2 of these were a growing tendency in the US. Today, all 3 are a growing tendency. The progression toward genocide includes discrimination, dehumanization, polarization, and persecution. There are actually a total of 10 steps. Extermination follows, and then often denial. Finally, if you can unmute, or Laura, Barbara, please unmute people. What do you think is the main factor for the prevention of genocide in the world today? Does anyone know, or would anyone like to venture a guess? Is anyone raising their hand?
I have no hands raised at the moment. No one dares.
Okay, well, this one floored me. The key factor: US involvement. That one hit me like a ton of bricks. Without it, There is very little to keep genocide from happening. If we ignore the warning signs and refuse involvement elsewhere in the world, we risk history repeating itself. Freedom and democracy are not self-perpetuating. It takes informed, vigilant, and socially active citizens to preserve national and personal freedoms. My family survived, but post-war Germany was a humanitarian disaster site. Its ruined cities were inundated by 14 million homeless, hungry, and impoverished refugees. And not only they, but everyone was starving. Worst of all, though, the continuing Soviet threat. It was thanks to the generosity of total strangers in a tiny farming community in Indiana that our family was able to immigrate to the US in late 1951. I will ask later, once we're done, if we have other immigrants or refugees in the audience, or perhaps some folks are children or grandchildren of immigrants. So it was on a dismal, foggy day that my father, Rolf, my mother, Lilo, who was 8 months pregnant at the time, and 4-year-old Ingo took their leave of Germany. They traveled across a rubble-strewn countryside to Switzerland, only to find that their flight to America would be postponed overnight due to the fog covering all of Northern Europe. But the next morning, on the brink of their odyssey to the New World, I made my entry into the post-war Old World. I didn't even say, sorry for the inconvenience. I just totally disrupted their immigration plans by my premature arrival. Eventually, though, we arrived in Wakarusa, Indiana, where our generous sponsors lived. We owe them a lifelong debt of gratitude. I dedicated Flight of Remembrance to the people of Wakarusa, as well as to my parents. I provided several presentations there since 2012, and we also renewed ties with a few people who still remember us. Love and dreams. Here, my brothers and I in the backyard of our first rented house. Remember my grandfather Ernst's boyhood dream to be captain of a ship bound for America? In 1952, he and my grandmother Maria boarded a ship bound for America. And no, he wasn't the captain, but with his skills no longer tied to the military of any world regime, he finally became the captain of his own destiny. And we became naturalized US citizens in 1958, all except for my younger brother at lower left. In a remarkable twist on a lifelong dream, both my father Rolf and grandfather Ernst were hired around that time by Chrysler Missile and Space Division near Detroit, where they worked on the Saturn V rocket. My father Rolf later became head of a team of engineers that designed components of the Saturn 1B rocket that were used successfully in all of the Apollo moon missions. Despite the upheaval and devastation of war, my father Rolf's career expanded far beyond his original aeronautical engineering dream to a key role in the emerging US space program. And my mother Lilo, she too achieved her dream of a harmonious marriage and family life. At back right in this photo is my maternal grandmother Gertrude. She is a major mover and shaker in the family story, especially the post-war part that I didn't tell you much about. After retiring to New Hampshire in 1982, Rolf found new meaning in his life. For over 30 years, he shared his aerospace knowledge and enthusiasm with thousands of children and adults all across the Granite State. Here, he's leading a young astronauts program in the 1980s, and here, a model rocket launch in Kensington in 2011. My parents' love story is really as much about finding meaning, cherishing a dream, and living a life of faith in God as it is about surviving war. Their positive attitudes have long inspired people around them. I encourage each of you to find the gem of meaning in your life that you can use to uplift and encourage others. And in closing, this photo from a 2013 model rocket launch is a reminder that what we share lives on in the lives and memories of those we inspire. It's also a reminder to speak up and take action on issues that truly matter. May our efforts today, as a society, as a country, launch a tomorrow free of war and genocide, blessed with liberty and justice, so that all people can fulfill their dreams and their life's purpose. And I thank you all for attending tonight. And I think now we will open it up for questions and discussion. So at this point, I am going to ask a couple of questions again. I know we have some things here in Q&A. Oh,
We have a comment.
Wendy and Fred Keith, you mentioned one parent had 2 Purple Hearts in Germany. One parent was in Japan, captain in the Marines. Both of these were father of Fred Keith and Wendy MacArthur Keith. Thank you so much for contributing that. And Tricia Sanger says, Tricia, your family was in the Soviet Union? Tricia, can you hear me?
She can hear you. She probably can't answer you because I have to find her on the list.
Can't answer. Okay. Tricia said Soviet Union. Oh, no, you were answering my question. Which country were
Yes.
people of German descent most afraid of? Okay. And Jackie Gendron also said Russia. Tricia said Dresden and yes, okay, we had some answers here. Okay, an anonymous attendee says, my father and his parents and siblings came to America from Austria. Those other relatives who didn't leave were annihilated in pogroms later. Oh, that is so upsetting. Yes, I think most people here in the US do not realize how devastating the war was all across Europe and Ukraine. And the devastation lasted long, long after the war was over. And of course, the Holocaust, that's a total disaster in itself, a tragedy of unimaginable proportions. Are there questions? All right.
If you'd like to ask a question out loud, just raise your hand.
While-
John Ray asks in the chat, have you been back to Germany to visit any family towns?
Oh, this is a question for me?
Yep.
Yes, I have been back to Germany. The little town of Havelberg, Germany, where my parents were married. You saw the beautiful cathedral there. They were getting off a little horse-drawn carriage. I visited that town. That town was really important to me to visit. And it is the town where my grandmother and my mother moved from Berlin. They fled Berlin, they moved there, and that probably saved their lives toward the end of the war. Had they remained in Berlin, their odds of survival would have been much worse. So I've been back there. I've also been to a number of other locations in Germany, and I visited Zurich, Switzerland, where I was born.
We have a question from Tricia Sanger and she'd like to ask it herself. Tricia, you can ask, speak away.
Hi, Tricia.
I think you need to unmute, Tricia.
Okay.
There we go.
Thank you so much for the perspective that we don't often hear. I had family members who had moved to Germany a family member who moved to Germany in the late 20s to go to school, married a German national, was living there and had children, and then the war broke out. So you have her husband who was a German national, herself who was an American citizen, who was caught up in what was happening, but had nothing to do with it. They were just living a normal life. They ended up coming back to the United States after World War II, but it certainly gave me a perspective of just the normal people that aren't the ones that declare war, that aren't the ones that necessarily support these things, but it's happening around them and they don't have a choice.
Yes, that is so true. That is a really good point, Tricia. I mean, people were caught up in this whirlwind, this destructive whirlwind, And it was a cataclysm like probably the world has never seen before and hopefully will never see again. We certainly hope not. But that's a remarkable story of your, was it your parents?
My in-laws.
In-laws, your in-laws.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you for sharing that. And I'd like to ask Guntis, are you still here, Guntis? You know you can't get away from me. You're going to have to say something about your family, right? While we're waiting, are you there? He is.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. All right. I would like you to unmute, stay muted. All right. So good. So what was the question?
I just wanted you to say a little about your family, where they were from, what they experienced.
Okay. Little perspective. My family, both sides, father and mother, grew up in Latvia. My mother was born on a farm out near Exeter, which is mid to the western section, out near a town called Valmiera. She was 14 when the war broke out. 29, 39. No, I'm sorry. She was 10 when the war broke out. They had to leave the farm out of the farms called Telmani in 1944. And that was basically because of a mistake that my grandfather made, figuring that it was going to be taken care of by the Germans as they came through to push the Soviets back. That didn't quite work out well for him. Interesting, your comment or one of the comments that you had made, Marina, was the I believe it was your father was an officer in the Tsarist army.
It was my grandfather.
Your grandfather. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense because my grandfather was an officer in the Tsarist cavalry during World War I, which was, he was blacklisted by Stalin, and he was one of the ones that he was trying to, or that Stalin was trying to deport out to Siberia, basically to eliminate him. But it's very similar background in that he was in the in World War I. He was in the Russian cavalry down in the southern tier, down by Astrakhan in that area, and he also came back to Latvia after World War I to become part of essentially the family story, Telmanu Simniks, which was, the Lord of Telmani. They had to leave in 44. They were bombed on the way out of Telmani, about 7 miles out, just a little bit south of Sasis. And my mother had had shrapnel wounds in her arm at the time, based on the bombing. Their trip took them to Riga, where they left Riga September 44. I think it was like 2 or 3 days just prior to Riga falling to the Soviets as they were moving through. On a boat to Danzig, which was, my ears perked up when you had mentioned Danzig there. And it was kind of interesting that they had arrived in Danzig late September and they were separated. My grandfather disappeared. We'll put that in quotes, not exactly sure where he went. My mother and my grandmother ended up going all the way over to the western side of Germany to a town called Oldenburg, because they had an address of a German soldier that had stayed at Telmani. He was assigned to the Eastern Front and did not make it back home. But he was willing to give them the address because they had taken care of him as a wounded soldier on the farm. They reunited in December on Christmas Day, December 25th, 1944, in Oldenburg, western side of Germany. And it's kind of interesting that, as you had mentioned, I didn't know the questions to ask my grandfather what happened during that 4-month time frame that he had disappeared, if you will, and then showed up December 44. They ended up emigrating into New York City. 1949, 1950 timeframe. And then from there, ended up meeting my father, his story starts in Riga. My grandfather on my father's side was a businessman. He was also blacklisted by Stalin. He took the land route out and ended up in Dresden, December of '44. As I had mentioned before, in the firestorm that had taken place in Dresden. I have a plate, and it's the only piece of artifact that I have from that time frame that survived the firestorm with my grandparents on my father's side. We still have that plate available, at home. It's just kind of interesting. They ended up emigrating pretty much the same way. The only difference is they were sponsored through Mississippi, so they came up through the southern part of the United States. I didn't get the full story before my grandparents had passed as to exactly what had happened with them, but they ended up in New York City eventually, where the Goncharov's family, if you will, ended up starting 1950 timeframe. One other comment that I had when you were talking a little bit about it, there are two books that are out there about the deportations. There's a book called These Names Accuse. It was written by, I believe it was the Latvian National Foundation World Federation of Free Latvians is who had actually published this book. And it lists all the names that were deported by Stalin and their demise, whether or not they actually arrived in Siberia, or they died on the way, or they were executed in Riga.
Were these people who were deported from Latvia or from all the Baltic states or from elsewhere too?
Just from Latvia.
Just from Latvia. I see.
Yeah. Which is kind of interesting.
Yes, absolutely. So I wrote the name down. These Names Accuse?
That's correct.
Title? Okay. Thank you so much for contributing that. I see we do have some other comments. So someone wrote, Stacy wrote, it's interesting to learn the perspective of refugees from the German point of view. What can we learn from this experience for refugees trying to come to the US now? Or refugees who are stuck in other countries in Europe and not even being able to get across borders, and they're stuck in camps. I think it's a terrible situation. I have a real bleeding heart for immigrants and refugees, probably because of our experience and how warmly we were welcomed. And I see how today refugees and immigrants are shunned. They are insulted. They are treated as less than human. And it upsets me greatly. This ties in with a comment from another anonymous attendee who says, I fear that some of what happened during World War I and World War II may happen again here in the US. The hate happening throughout the country now is like what happened at the beginning of Hitler's regime. I am very much in agreement with that, very much. And I have actually said on a number of occasions to people close to me, if genocide were ever to be perpetrated here in the US, it would be far worse than what happened over in Europe and maybe even the Soviet Union. Think about how isolated we are as a continent. We can keep a lot of secrets in this place. And I feel, I also am very upset about the things I see happening. So the 10 steps of genocide, so what leads up to it: political instability, exclusionary ideology with one or more identified scapegoats, a national policy of isolationism. We don't dare go any further with any of those than we have already gone. Then the progression: discrimination, dehumanization, polarization, and then persecution, extermination, and then denial. We can see how things like that can get out of hand, and the people involved in it deeply believe in what they are doing. This is the thing to remember. They're not just crazy people. They're not just people who are adopting some kind of weird stance. Now, some of them maybe do, some of the leaders, but the followers, they believe it. They are invested in it totally. So someone says, how young were some of the boy soldiers in Germany? This is from Wendy and Fred Keith. Well, toward the end of the war, especially in Berlin, when the last fighting occurred, some of them were very young, possibly even under 10 years old. I don't know the facts, but I know that there were many who were only 11 or 12 years old, and they were conscripted to try to save the city of Berlin. And I'm sure many died. I don't have figures.
Tricia Sanger would like to ask a question or make a comment. Tricia, are you there? You need to unmute.
Yep. Okay. When you were discussing about, what did people know? I just think it's an important thing to remember or to bring to everyone's attention that there was particularly a story of a group of students in Bavaria. They called themselves the White Rose. And during Hitler's reign, they were handing out a series of pamphlets that were telling people what to protest against Hitler. And they were rounded up and they were beheaded. Yes. And you can look up their story, the White Rose. And it's just so important to understand that ruthless regimes, they don't tolerate people speaking out. And, you'd have to risk your life to speak out. And I don't know how many of us would do that.
Absolutely. So right. Yes, they were very courageous. I have a book about the White Rose. I think it's on my suggested reading list that you will hopefully all be receiving. But it is definitely a good read, and it is something everyone should be aware of. There actually was resistance in Germany beyond that too. The Confessing Church in Germany, which was headed by Dietrich Bonhoeffer, maybe some of you have heard of him, was opposed to what Hitler was doing in Germany. However, they were not able to do all that much. By that time, the church and people in general had really been oppressed and repressed to the point where they couldn't take much action. But Dietrich Bonhoeffer got involved in plots to help Jews escape Germany. That got him arrested. And he also actually considered whether he might want to be the one to pull the trigger and kill Hitler. And this was a man who was deeply religious, who had a deep sense of pacifism, that he would feel inclined to do that himself goes to show the depth of the desperation that existed in that time period. Are there other questions?
There's one other comment on the Q&A. Oh, it's from Tricia Sanger, talking about ordinary Germans' responsibility for the Holocaust. She says it's extremely important to know about the ruthless punishment for Germans who spoke out, specifically university students in Munich who gave out leaflets against Hitler. So I think we just called on her and she asked about that. And a thank you for reminding us of those terrible steps toward genocide.
By the time it got to that point, there really was no resistance that was safe. At the very least, you'd be sent to a concentration camp, and like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, he was eventually he was killed. He was killed only days or maybe a week before the Allies liberated the part of Germany where he was being held. A very, very sad thing.
Well, I think you've given us a lot to think about tonight. Thank you so much, Laura. Any more comments to finish us out? We'll put back on here, so we'll appear magically.
All of you again for attending. And when you receive the reading list, the last page of that file has an order form for my book. If you'd like to order a book and get it signed by me, I'd be happy to send one out to you. And also, if you go to my website, kirschstonebooks.com, so it's KIRSCHSTONE.com, well, the most important book option, purchase options are on there. There are links for Amazon, a link to download an order form, and so on. So thank you again, and I appreciate your contributions to the conversation and questions this evening.
And we would like to thank the New Hampshire Humanities for sponsoring this program. You can learn more about the New Hampshire Humanities by visiting their website at nhhumanities.org. Or if you'd rather contact us, we can get you in touch. Now you'll be redirected to their audience survey, and we ask that you fill it out. Take a few moments. They'd really appreciate it. And thank you for attending. We'll see you next month.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a great night.